episode 67, Thomas Pynchon and the American Reconquista, Part 1. Well, so, Thomas Pynchon, if not the greatest living American novelist, and certainly one of the two greatest living American novelists, and a writer whose work, like Joyce, for example, I think should really be read as a whole, but interestingly, a writer whose later and, in most instances, more accessible work will tend to clarify some of the themes and devices of his earlier and more complicated stuff. And it seems to me that over the last 15, 20 years or so of Pynchon's output, he has become expressly concerned with this thing that I am thinking of, and I think he wouldn't mind me calling it, the American Reconquest, La Reconquista Americana. And you may be asking exactly what that refers to, because of course the entire hideous, bloody history of this continent is a history of reconquest. You know how that goes, over and over and over. Someone out there alone in the dark manages to find what looks for a moment like safety or peace or even just a place to rest. And very soon, the same old ugly forces that have been dogging this place since Europeans first arrived here show up, take it back, monetize it, and kick out whoever discovered it. That's a history as old as the Americas themselves, since at least they've been called the Americas. But the particular American Reconquest we're talking about here is essentially the history of the 20th century, considered from a different angle. And though Pynchon's work takes in almost all of the 20th century at one point or another, there's a specific focus on the Reconquista as it happens in, say, right about the last third, or if you like, the second half of the 20th century, with a great deal of focus on the 1960s. Now, the 1960s are a difficult thing to talk about, not least because they have been, perhaps more than any other time in American history, repackaged into sepia-tone nostalgic bullshit over and over and over. But Pynchon is, in some very real ways, a writer of the 1960s. He wrote arguably his most famous and influential work during that period, The Crying of Lot 49, and a certain amount of Gravity's Rainbow, though we'll probably never know exactly how much. And his later work often specifically focuses on the 60s as a time period, and even when it doesn't, is laden with 60s cultural references, sometimes intensely anachronistic ones. There's a lot to say, for example, about the sort of intratemporal penetration of the American 60s into the European 40s in Gravity's Rainbow. And we here at Death is Just Around the Corner certainly hope to talk about that at some point. All of this to say that Pynchon can hardly be considered apart from the American 60s for a number of reasons, and that the particular kind of reconquest that he has most persistently charted, especially in his later work, is a conquest of territory briefly opened in that same, well, I was going to say decade, but here's the thing about the 60s. They're not so much a decade as a kind of geological epoch. The 60s, the way we talk about them, the way we think and remember, they're not necessarily every year beginning 196 in this particular calendar. I would say, for example, that you could say the 60s last from 1964 to 1974, something like that. Or if you want to peg it to particular events, say from the moment the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show to the moment in August 74 when Richard Nixon resigned over Watergate. I think that would be a decent set of references in which to enclose the 60s as a cultural phenomenon. Now, admittedly, I wasn't around for the 60s, and I am no proponent of nostalgia. I look back at them and I see a lot of bullshit self-indulgence disguised as spiritual discovery, a lot of bullshit self-importance disguised as political action, a lot of supposed counterculture immediately sold out, mass-produced, simplified, dumbed down, and made universal and suburban, and the outward adoption of all sorts of stylistic devices with absolutely no concurrent change to the power structures and the individuals which and who adopted those stylistic devices. I am not a big fan. I am not, as Tom York used to sing, someone who wishes it was the 60s. To me, Woodstock is one of the more depressing moments in recent human history. The ultimate example of the fucking Roman carnivalesque overpowering whatever it was that people thought they were doing. But you would have to admit that the 60s, especially, this concept of the long 60s, lasting until nearly 1975, was probably the single most inventive period for music in modern Western history. And not just in, the rock or pop domains with which we identify the era, but in jazz, in that kind of music we so awkwardly call modern classical, in the equally awkward category of the thing we wretchedly label world music. Musicians from other countries, other cultures, other musical backgrounds entirely, and I don't just mean stylistic musical backgrounds, I mean entirely different senses of how the scale works, entirely different harmonic systems, entirely different patterns of rhythmic reference, all bumping up against this stuff coming primarily out of England and the United States, and leading to an incredible musical ferment, the like of which had never been seen, and in that specific form will probably never be seen again. I could say more later if you'd like about why I think that was the first and last time that'll ever happen. And there was, of course, literature in the 60s apart from Pynchon. There were movies in the 60s, all of these media, or if you prefer, artistic forms, finding a kind of freedom to experiment that hadn't apparently been present, although I, for one, would argue that a whole lot of the, hip or groundbreaking art of the 1960s was just the commercial codification of work that other, and this is important, much poorer, much worse known people had been doing in the 40s and 50s, people laboring away in the darkness like Maya Deren and Stan Brakhage and Charles Olson, people who could scarcely feed themselves, let alone become countercultural icons, although a number of them got a shot as their careers dwindled, and often with the dwindling of the careers came the dwindling of their lives. So, a conflicted territory, to be sure. Something it's difficult to approach with any kind of equanimity. But I have to take it from someone like Thomas Pynchon, a witness whom I trust, that there was this moment in the 60s, and depending on who you ask, it may have lasted 6 months or a year or 2 years, when another world seemed not just possible, but about to emerge from this one. When, in one of Pynchon's favorite tropes, you could stand against the day or just a few inches to the side of the day. Everything you had been taught, all the protocol of daylight and public behavior with which you had been inculcated, It all shifted off its axis just a little bit. And through the crack between that and the edge of the frame, you were able to perceive a world which, though ostensibly and outwardly identical with the world you knew, was so charged with the possibility for transformation, with a whole alchemical index of dormant changes, that you could never return to the official reinstalled public daylight as quite the same person or feeling that you had lived in quite the same world. And throughout all the best art of the 60s, and particularly the long 60s going into the early 1970s, there is this sense, alternately terrifying and liberatory, of the radical artificiality of human life, of the fact that most of what we do is simply made up. It sure comes from somewhere. It's the enormously complicated genetic project and product of a history going back probably tens of thousands of years. You can trace precursors, you can identify etymologies and lineages. All of this is true. And it's not as if, this made-up world doesn't have the power to kill. It absolutely does. In fact, it primarily holds on to power by killing. But it is made up. And every once in a while, you get to have a moment in which you understand, not just intellectually, but viscerally, how very flimsy the whole facade of the official world is, and how easy it should be, at least, to just step back, step to the side, take off at a strange diagonal, and find yourself in a world for which you had never been prepared, a world, if not less artificial, then at least beholden to different codes and tenets of artifice. And sometimes, as any number of ill-fated travelers learned in the 1960s, these other worlds are dangerous as hell. These other worlds are places where the difference between living and dying is something as simple and blunt and stupid as the differences between dialects or forms of slang, or knowing exactly what you can say when and to whom, or rates of exchange that may or may not have anything to do with metal or paper currency. I take it, because there are enough intelligent people who tell me that it's true, that this sense of possibility was real. And I take it likewise that it was violently foreclosed upon. And this is a large part of what I'm talking about when I talk about the American Reconquest. This specific American Reconquest, lasting from whatever year you want to start it in, say 1966 or 7, to the present, and certain to endure long beyond the present. It takes a lot of forms. It will no doubt take more by the time I'm finished speaking, but arguably its primary engine is the technological control system, which of course brings along with it any manner of necessary political and economic encumbrances to make sure that the technological control system is allowed to operate unimpeded. You have to hobble the rest of the world to make sure things are going all right for the machines. And it says something about the speed of evolution of this process that even the word machine seems rather outdated, doesn't it? Machine sounds like it's describing something with visible knobs and gears and levers and gauges. And the control systems we're talking about, they rest inside of absolutely blank housing, the inner workings of which we scarcely understand, and refer to processes so apparently massive and abstract that you would have to be a specialist even to be able to manipulate the most basic jargon about them. And if you were to become a specialist, well, the only way to do that is by enlisting in one of the various programs which will eventually convert you into an apostle for the regime as it already is. This is one of the great problems with economics, for example. Most instruction in economics is not to explain how anything works, or for that matter, how things don't work. It's to train you to be a rhetorical defender of the way things are. It is to inculcate into you what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. But this, of course, is an entirely artificial fate, a fate that has been constructed by a relatively small group of people for relatively comprehensible and brutal purposes. And it's important, I think, to note here that when we talk about technological control systems, we are apt to lapse into the language of, as I said earlier, evolution. See, friends, brothers, sisters, it's got even me. It's burrowed into all of our spines. It's sucking on the roots of all of our brains right now. We are apt to naturalize the process of technological expansion as if it were something that just had to happen, as if it were that God almighty Western phenomenon called progress, something which I take it a number of you will have figured out by now doesn't exist. There's no such thing as progress. Never has been, never will be. But that doesn't stop us from making constant verbal recourse to us, because that's the way we've been taught to speak. And in Pynchon's other work, Gravity's Rainbow, most obviously, we receive a thorough autopsy of the way that human society and the inmost, the most specific, the least tractable, apparently, regions of the human mind have been colonized by this virus that teaches us to think of not just history in the human sense, but time itself, geology, cosmological evolution, as the linear dialectic of the emergence of technology. Now, that's right at the heart of the American Reconquest, but that's something that starts a good deal before the 1960s. And in order to make some of Pynchon's earlier work more comprehensible, we want to start with some of the later work, some of the easier work. To do that, we have to talk about the specific 1960s of Thomas Pynchon and why he was uniquely well positioned before the decade even started to have a little bit different view of what was going on than most of his contemporaries would have been. Thomas Pynchon was born in 1937, so little young to be a beatnik, just a little old to be a hippie, although there were plenty of hippies who didn't mind the age gap, plenty of, in particular, older male hippies who were thrilled with the sudden supply of young women who would buy into their bullshit. But nonetheless, Pynchon was 23 when the 1960s started. He was to be a young man of the 60s. But Pynchon had also had something of an odd career path up to that point. He was a, child prodigy as a mathematician, specifically in physics, and went to Cornell for the engineering physics program at 16. Your prototypical whiz kid. So this would be 1953. 2 years later, 55, he suddenly drops out and joins the Navy. 2 years after that, 57, he's back at Cornell, but now he's studying English literature. A couple years after that, he is working for Boeing, one of the largest defense contractors in the United States, really in the world. And he is, in his free time, writing, or perhaps by that point revising, much of what will become V, his first novel. And it's important here, though I don't want to get into a deep discussion of V, to note, I think, how comparatively even-toned and sentimental and quote-unquote reasonable that book is. It is very much more taken up with narrative convention than the rest of his work, even if it's, fractured, non-linear narrative convention, and very much more apt to occasionally dispense a sentence that we, the readers, are supposed to understand as something like that horrible thing, the moral of the work, which in V would probably be that famous phrase, keep cool but care. It is remarkable that within just a couple of years, Thomas Pynchon would change from the man who wrote Keep Cool But Care to the man who wrote The Crying of Lot 49, a book that, for convenience's sake, we'll call wildly paranoid, although if by paranoid you mean referring to something unreal, well, shit, then it's not paranoid at all. I want to look into how Pynchon made that change, how the writer of V ceased to exist, and the writer of Lot 49 and eventually Gravity's Rainbow and the rest of his oeuvre came to be. And I suspect it's got something to do with the odd discontinuities in that career. College for physics, Navy, college for English, Boeing, and then suddenly novelist and the famous disappearance. You know, he has only been even arguably seen once since the early 1960s, and there's no verification of that one photograph. Doesn't do interviews, doesn't talk to the press. Will occasionally do some jokey sort of public half appearance, like lending his voice to The Simpsons, for example, which he's done a couple of times. But other than that, stays in the dark. Well, I don't want to impute anything to Thomas Pynchon. I certainly don't want to accuse him of anything. This is a conjecture on my part. But that odd career, the discontinuities in his education, the naval service, the sudden placement at a defense contractor, that sounds to me a great deal like the career path of a young man being groomed for work in the intelligence services. Now, I am not saying, let me be very clear about this, that Thomas Pynchon had any idea he was being groomed for work in the intelligence services, if indeed he was. And I'm certainly not saying, he would have accepted that if he'd known about it. I think it's quite clear from all of his work that he would have told those people to fuck off. I am saying, though, that he would have been on their radar. And by their, I mean all kinds of people. In this particular case, I think the CIA and the Office of Naval Intelligence are probably the most relevant. A guy who was clearly a genius, who had military service, and whose genius not only took in more than one discipline, but took in what are generally supposed to be, diametrically opposed disciplines, the humanities and the hard sciences. Well, how could they have resisted? And then he goes to work at Boeing, and it is more than anything else his work at Boeing, which I think gives Thomas Pynchon the ability to see the 60s as something other than what his contemporaries were seeing. Because while he's at Boeing, Pynchon, he's basically a PR flack. He writes for the company magazine, but he writes for the company magazine of one very specific part of Boeing. That is the section that is working on a project called Beaumark. And Beaumark was a plan, and eventually a reality, the plan was achieved, to establish missile bases all over the United States so that any interfering Russian aircraft entering American airspace could be confronted and shot down. This is the theory, anyway. When they ran simulations, they actually found that the Beaumark system was likely to be about 25% effective. You can read into that what you will. I mean, missile defense systems are famously inefficient. Some of you probably remember Ronald Reagan and Star Wars and what a massive pork barrel clusterfuck that was. So, no doubt, there is a great amount of sheer greed in this. You could, however, and I'm not saying that you should, I mean, we here at Death is Just Around the Corner, we would never say you should do anything. But you could say that there is something a little bit ominous about the massive presence of missiles, many of them nuclear missiles, in a distributed grid around the entire continental United States, even though the people installing them know their alleged purpose is meaningless. You could look, for example, at the fact that in 1960, a Beaumark missile caught on fire at an Air Force base in Burlington, New Jersey. And though the fire didn't trigger the warhead, the firefighters putting out the fire accidentally managed to spread fissionable plutonium all over the fucking place. And the entire site had to be covered with a layer of concrete and turned into a stay-away zone for 30-something years. 1960, same year Pynchon goes to work at Boeing. This would have been a hot story. You know, he would have known about this. This would have been the kind of worry that hung in the back of his head every day there. Perhaps more interesting, though, than the Beaumark plan itself, this distributed network of missile facilities, is the way Beaumark worked. Because all these missile facilities required some means of communicating with each other, and because they were there supposedly to intercept incoming aircraft, or eventually, once this technology was developed, incoming ICBMs, they had to be able to communicate quickly. So the Beaumark project, its most fascinating feature in retrospect was a thing called SAGE, SAGE, which was an acronym for Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. And SAGE was essentially a direct precursor of the internet. It was a system of computer mainframes at each of these Beaumark sites, each of which in turn was plugged into a dedicated cable network, phone lines, I believe, running all over the country, making electronic data from any given Beaumark site accessible to any of the others at what would have been an astonishing speed for 1962, although I'm guessing now it would sound, frankly, kind of depressing. Funny, isn't it, how we lend an emotional coefficient to these things, how seeing 96 kbps by an audio file is not just, an inconvenience, but an occasion for active disaffection. SAGE eventually becomes the blueprint for ARPANET, which is mentioned specifically in Inherent Vice, Pynchon's 2010 novel, some of you have probably heard of before, the electronic network developed by the Advanced Research Projects Administration, which would subsequently have its name changed to DARPA. And I know a little bit about the technical upgrades from SAGE to ARPANET, but the point is that Pynchon, as early as 1962, was aware that the United States was blanketed by an enormous electronic messaging network about which most citizens had no idea at all. And though its ostensible purpose was to send data from missile site to missile site, and it did, I'm sure, do that, it could also be used to send almost any kind of data to any receiver properly outfitted. It would fall inevitably into the hands of, let's say, the police or the various intelligence agencies, because that is what technology does in this country. And it didn't take a great deal of prescience, I don't think, although Pynchon does have a great deal of prescience, to project from the existence of something like SAGE an era in which such a communications network would be public, would be widely known about, would be used by tens or hundreds of millions of people, but would probably still have connections to its military, industrial, and intelligence roots that most of those users wouldn't know anything about. One final interesting feature of SAGE, too, that it was able to input new autopilot coordinates into the computer's onboard interceptor jets without any cooperation from the pilots. Now, this was allegedly to save time in the case of a scenario in which they had to, intercept a Russian jet, and to eliminate the possibility of human error in the air, which, again, may be true enough. It probably would have occurred to someone like Pynchon as well that that ability could also be used to input coordinates into those planes' autopilot systems that would provoke some sort of interaction with a Russian plane, that would instigate the sort of incident that would justify, oh, I don't know, something like all-out nuclear war, for which, conveniently, we would already have nuclear missiles stationed all over the United States, ready to deploy in all kinds of directions. So this is the knowledge with which Pynchon enters the 60s, and I think it is the root of the enormous suspiciousness that courses through all of his work, particularly his 60s focused work. People call him paranoid all the time. He calls himself paranoid. The word paranoia is enormously common in his work. But clinically speaking, there is very little paranoia in Thomas Pynchon. Almost all of his fears, or his character's fears, relate to something very, very real. And though their explanations for those real phenomena may not always be correct, that doesn't make them paranoid. That just makes them mistaken. We should take some distance from that word paranoid. We should be careful with what we apply it to. So, in talking about the way that Pynchon's latest work makes the theme of American reconquest more explicit and thereby makes his earlier work somewhat more accessible, I want to talk about that book I mentioned, Inherent Vice. Came out in 2010 and was treated upon publication by all the middlebrow mediocrities of the normal literary review establishment as a lark, as Pynchon does detective fiction, as, thank God, a genre novel. Because if you're a thick-skulled asshole like Harold Bloom, for instance, or Michiko Kakutani, or whomever, you know perfectly well how to deal with a piece of quote-unquote genre fiction. You just look for the genre conventions, and then you map the way that the author departs from them, and bang, there's your analysis, if we want to confer that word upon it. And particularly after Against the Day, Pynchon's previous book from 2006, maybe 2005, by far the most sprawling thing he'd ever written, although arguably not the most complicated, which is a whole other question. After Against the Day, these people were thrilled with the idea of a book that was going to be less than 400 pages long and have something like a discernible plot, even if a complicated one, because, you get a complicated plot in Against the Day, as a reviewer, you're responsible for actually paying attention, knowing what's going on. And, that's not why anyone becomes a professional book reviewer. Or rather, that's not how any of the reviewers who work at places like The New Yorker or Harper's get their jobs. If you pay that kind of attention, you are doomed to obscurity forever. But in a book that is, like Inherent Vice, self-consciously a version of a film noir, you can just assume that the enormous complication of the plot is supposed to function as a device for bewilderment, because this is a famous cliche of the film noir genre, right? The people who wrote The Big Sleep have talked about how they're not exactly sure what the plot ends up meaning, or in fact, whether or not any given plot point is necessarily resolved. We, as readers and as, putative reviewers, are just kind of allowed to let all this complication wash over us and enjoy the bewilderment of it, both in terms of our own, overloaded sensoria and in terms of the characters' reactions. This is essentially the motive force of The Big Lebowski, right? That it's a film noir, the central character in which doesn't particularly give a shit and doesn't know what's going on and doesn't care enough to figure out what's going on and pretty much just wants to fuck off and go home. And people love that movie. For good reason. It's a brilliant movie. So I think people treated Inherent Vice more or less the same way. In fact, I should say, from having read their reviews, I know the significant part of the commentary had treated it that way. And it has since been, I think, dismissed as, a minor work, a bagatelle, something Pynchon did just sort of to keep the fires burning. Actually, I think that that description applies much better to Bleeding Edge, his most recent book from 2013, which I think, though it's not a bad book, is by far the least impressive thing he's ever written. Inherent Vice, however, there's a lot more going on there than goofy film noir parody and, outsized hippie caricatures. I think the 2014 film made out of it by Paul Thomas Anderson hints very beautifully at this. Though Anderson has to leave out a bunch of plot points and sometimes elide one scene into another to the point that certain narrative lines become pretty much inscrutable unless you've read the book. I do think he did a fantastic job bringing out the general, non-specific, addled undertow of menace that flows all through, or perhaps more accurately, beneath Inherent Vice. And Pache, with apologies to my esteemed colleague Roger Bellin at the Sometime Seminar, I do think the darkness that Anderson coaxed out of the film is present in the book. It's just buried and implicit and hanging around the edges of the scene, the frame, the phenomena all the time, as it is in a lot of Pynchon's work. So, Inherent Vice specifically, what's going on here? Well, as I say, the plot's very complicated, and I'm not just going to recount the whole thing. I mean, you ought to read the book. But I think it is, more than anything else, one among several of Pynchon's documents of this Reconquista Americana. And it's important that though the book is full of, 60s jokes, 60s references, it actually takes place in 1970. And 1970 is if not a particularly important year in itself, a particularly important part of what I've been calling the long 60s. Because by 1970, Fred Hampton is dead. Both Kennedys are dead. Martin Luther King is dead. And though the truth of any of those deaths may be suppressed, well, was suppressed, still hasn't officially come out in most cases, everyone had suspicions, particularly the members of, any sort of putative counterculture, especially if that counterculture was of the rare remainder that had definite political convictions and definite political aims and hadn't just sort of settled into the minor goal of living a life as groovy as circumstances permitted. This is another important thing about about 1970. Though again, of course, we're not talking in universals here. I think it would be generally fair to say that by 1970, the most explicitly militant factions of the quote-unquote counterculture had dissolved or more likely been destroyed, had been infiltrated, had been turned on each other, had been imprisoned in various spurious ways, or had just been killed. And the book also makes specific reference on a number of occasions to Charles Manson, which is an important phenomenon on all kinds of levels. First of all, and this is the register in which Pynchon refers to Manson, the fact that, this kind of supposedly free-flowing, loose, improvisatory hippie culture where people just kind of showed up and left on their own schedules and you didn't worry too much about who was who, where he or she was coming from, where he or she was going. You just, went with it. Well, Charles Manson put an end to all of that. I recall Joan Didion writing about the moment she heard about the Manson murders and saying, what I remember, I'm paraphrasing here, what I remember most about that moment is that neither I nor any of my friends were surprised that something like that had happened. And she recalls specifically a scene in which she hears a strange noise in her house and comes downstairs and sees a very confused looking young man standing in the hallway. And she says, hello? And this young man looks at her and says, Chicken Delight? And Joan says, well, A, Chicken Delight doesn't deliver, and B, you don't have a box or a bag or anything. And the young man says, oh, and then he leaves the house. That kind of event has a very, very different charge after Charles Manson than it did before. And the joke Pynchon writes at one point, it's the scene in which several of the characters are driving, or rather are riding in a car driven by a girl named Japonica Finway, who is having some sort of, schizoid, possibly drug-induced vision, so they get pulled over. And the cop who pulls them over says, yeah, it's this new law. We have to pull over any vehicle containing 4 or more people on the suspicion that it might constitute a cult. Well, that never happened, obviously. California never passed that law. There were actually people trying to get California to pass laws like that after Manson. Pynchon is not just being farcical there. There was a moment when it was possible that California would institute that kind of utter police state. There's also a whole other road we could go down here with Manson. Some of you probably know about Dave McGowan, his book Weird Scenes in the Canyon, his general theses about the connections between the Laurel Canyon hippie scene and the defense industry and a number of other shady programs. I, for one, don't take McGowan all that seriously. I think his technique as a writer essentially consists of piling up coincidental-looking things and then just sort of going, see, without really elucidating any of the connections between them, or certainly not, providing proof of any of the connections between them. But the things he's pointing to, they are weird fucking things. They are dubious. They are threatening. They do point to relationships that certainly weren't on the surface then and haven't really been disclosed since then. Manson, look, I'm not an expert here, folks. I'm just a simple radio broadcaster. I would have to do more research, and I probably will. But I think there is at least some evidence to suggest that Manson was kept fed and sheltered during the period that led to the formation of the family and eventually those murders by some sort of agency, whether LAPD or CIA, if there was even a difference between them at the time, who wanted to provoke a leftist or countercultural group into committing some kind of cultural outrage that would provide not just an opportunity for the police to crack down on freaks and hippies, but they hoped, a general turn in sentiment against the, hip or leftist youth. As I say, I've got to look into this more, but such things did happen, are documentable in other cases. At some point on this fine program, presuming we're allowed to keep broadcasting it, I do hope to get a little bit into the history of the Symbionese Liberation Army and the completely fake official story of the Patty Hearst kidnapping. But friends, that's something for another day. So to return to Inherent Vice, 1970, the general possibility, or rather, I should say, the vision of the possibility of some transformed America has already begun to wither pretty quickly, pretty violently. And in its place, you have a whole lot of people whose countercultural affiliations basically extend to just trying to get through the day as best they can with the aid of whatever drugs they've become accustomed to, whatever music they like, whatever little, subcultural group they have some cachet with. It is not a deeply politicized time, at least not among the milieu of the book's characters in Los Angeles 1970. Now, of course, there was politicized activity in Los Angeles 1970. We'll talk about some of it. But I'm talking about the people that Pynchon's writing about. And insofar as the book has, a story, that story basically concerns a hippie private eye named Doc Sportello, who is asked by his ex, Shasta Faye Hepworth, to look into the disappearance of a real estate developer named Mickey Wolfman. That's your basic one-line setup. What the book comes to be about is Sportello discovering the various facets of this thing called the Golden Fang. Now, I want to point to something very important about Pynchon's technique here and in general, a way he tells the truth when other writers don't. So many novelists in this position, set us up some kind of mystery, would lead us to a solution in which there is one singular villain, one particular agency in the philosophical sense, responsible for whatever indignity or injustice has spurred the action of the book. And instead, what Pynchon does, here as in all of his work, is to lead us to a network, and not just a network, but a network of whose total shape we can barely get a grasp. A network that extends beyond our ability even to make a reliable blueprint. Something so schematically sprawling, among which, or I should say among the constituent parts of which, the connections are so strange and sometimes tenuous that we're not even sure whether we should consider them real or not. Pynchon's doing this not just because it's better as literature, though it is, but because this is how power fucking works. This is one of the great discoveries of power after the era of the fascist autocrat. There's a lot to say here in reference to Gravity's Rainbow, and we'll get there, don't worry. And in reference to Max Weber's concept of the routinization of charisma, which of course Pynchon mentions in Gravity's Rainbow. But the short version is that we pass out of an era of one-man governments, of l'état c'est moi, of dictators whose word is, as under der Führerprinzip in Nazi Germany, literally law, and into an era of networks and distributed systems, the personnel of which may not even particularly matter. And this, too, is an important and a deeply dispiriting point. And if you consider yourself anything like a member, whatever that means, or a partisan or a supporter of the American left, this is something you've probably recognized before, but if not, you better recognize and deal with it real fucking quick. What we are up against is not anything that can be tied to any individual human being. I mean, sure, certain people with definite names and addresses are responsible in the immediate short term for certain conditions, certain acts, certain atrocities, right? But had they not been there, the system would have supplied other people to do exactly the same work. A few minor stylistic differences, a personalized touch here and there maybe, but when not only governance, not only, politics in the broad sense, not only economics, but really the whole systematized behavior of the first world, and with it the other two presumptive worlds dragging along, is based on forms of technological control, and particularly automated forms of technological control, The system doesn't need any particular person to get its own interests accomplished, which are essentially to proliferate, to gain in power, to become more and more indispensable. This, incidentally, is an interesting valence, an interesting implication of that famous and often misunderstood Marshall McLuhan phrase that the medium is the message. People always take that to mean something like, the point of TV isn't the show that's on TV, it's TV itself. And of course, that's true. That's absolutely right. That is part of what McLuhan meant. But he meant medium in a much, much larger sense. A sense in which, for example, you could say that politics in the game show spectacle sense of the word, politics as the thing they do on Fox and MSNBC, is a medium, and that its only purpose is to perpetuate itself, to make itself at least appear indispensable. Thus, with technological control systems as well, they have desires. These desires are, structural. These desires are, if you like, architectural. If you like, you can say mathematic. Hell, if you want to pursue it even further, if you're one of those sadly benighted people who believes in the, independent, ideal existence of numbers apart from humanity, you could say it's coded into the cosmos. And what the hell? I don't believe that about numbers, but maybe on some predatory level it is coded into the cosmos. These systems want things, and they will find the personnel to enact the things they want. There is no person you can hurt in the United States whose, injury or incapacitation or even death will make all that much difference. If the entire executive branch just disappeared tomorrow, it would be replaced by people whose agenda was substantially the same, and who, in the case of our particular era, would probably be better at carrying it out. This is one of the great hideous truths of history roughly after World War II, and particularly from the early to mid-60s onward. And to return to Inherent Vice, though Sportello, the private eye, is asked to look into this real estate developer, Mickey Wolfman, what he ends up discovering is this entity called the Golden Fang. And as I have mentioned already, it's not exactly clear where the Golden Fang begins or ends, or what all of its properties and components are, but we can safely say a few things about it. Number one, in the most literal sense, it's a boat. It's a boat that used to be called the Preserved, that came into the ownership of an actor named Burke Stodger, who was briefly blacklisted during the Red Scare until he ratted out a bunch of other actors with lefty politics and suddenly was back in the good graces of the studios and making movies in which he was, a patriotic American hero destroying communism and so forth. And this boat, the Preserved, became the Golden Fang. Number two, it's a gun-running operation, presumably a CIA gun-running operation. The Golden Fang has been used to carry weapons to Cuba, among other places. And given the time period we're talking about here, Pynchon specifically mentions the early 60s, we can pretty safely infer Brazil in there. Guatemala may very well be in there. Really, assuming a long enough lifespan on the boat, virtually every country in Latin America. Third, the Golden Fang is a heroin smuggling operation because the boat is being used to bring heroin back from the Golden Triangle, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, because let's not forget the Vietnam War is going on during all of this. Fourth, the Golden Fang is a supposed drug rehab and wellness clinic called Kriskilodon, which means, in some kind of Greek, golden animal tooth, golden fang. The CIA is importing all of this heroin, getting, counterculture types, kids, hippies, whoever hooked on it, then sending them to this institute, charging them out the ass to get rehabbed. And fifth, Golden Fang is a program that the police, presumably, in this case the LAPD, maybe also the FBI and or the CIA, are running out of the Kriskilodon Institute, offering these kids the chance to get their lives back together by turning snitch, by becoming local or federal informants. One of the book's main, you couldn't really call him main characters because he hardly appears, but main personages, a guy who haunts a lot of the book, Coy Harlingen, is a former saxophone player who did exactly this. Got deep into heroin, left his wife and child to try to clean up, did it at Kriskilodon, and ended up getting inducted into the snitch program that targets, exactly those vulnerable people. Now, here's, a characteristic Pynchon touch about this network, as I've mentioned before, that we don't know exactly where it begins or ends. Those are the things we can say are pretty clearly Golden Fang. But there are a number of other things going on in the book that may be extensions of the Golden Fang, too. For example, it is heavily implied that that Golden Fang money and resources may be funneled into a fascist paramilitary organization called Vigilant California that takes care of little missions the cops can't be observed executing, and that there may be a connection between the Golden Fang and a loan shark and bookie named Adrian Prussia, who is also an LAPD hitman. At one point, in fact, is contracted to kill an LAPD officer. And then we see at one point heroin being loaded up in the basement underneath the building that holds Adrian Prussia's business. So it's possible that CIA heroin, via this whole Golden Fang operation, is being run through the LAPD and to Adrian Prussia, who is then helping to distribute it. And the central cop character in Inherent Vice, a guy named Bigfoot Bjornson, at one point offers Doc Sportello the opportunity to become an informant and tells him, if you'd rather be paid in something other than money, we can certainly arrange that too. We have an evidence room full of more drugs and better quality drugs than you have ever imagined in your life. So map the territories of Reconquest here. Beginning first, before we even address the Golden Fang question, with Mickey Wolfman, the real estate developer. A guy whose literal job in Los Angeles in particular is to find cheap land, usually because it's land lived on by non-white people, buy it, tear everything out, and build expensive new condos and, suburban homes that will price the non-white people out of those neighborhoods. There's a scene early in the book, for example, in which an Artesia Crip named Tariq Khalil comes and visits Doc, gives him a tip about one case, but on the way out says, by the way, when I got out of prison, I went home to see my old stomping grounds, and it's just not fucking there. And Doc says, what do you mean not there? And he says, I mean, it's gone. It's physically gone. And in its place are some trailers for construction workers and a sign saying, coming soon, Channelview Estates, a Michael Wolfman concept. So the first and most basic kind of reconquest, actual physical territory. And the novel is full of references to that kind of reconquest, and specifically, as I say, to land in which non-white people live being basically stolen by white people and gentrified into yet another upper middle class burb, so that the acceptable part of Los Angeles, the non-ghetto part of Los Angeles, can keep expanding and expanding and expanding. It's also implied, by the way, that Mickey Wolfman may have some kind of Golden Fang connection. He eventually ends up at the Criskyllidon Institute. There is the possibility, I take it, that his land deals are being used to launder the money from heroin. And we find out later that the FBI is interested in using him as a potential casino owner or front for a casino owner as a way to force the mafia out of their control of the Vegas Strip. So yet another reconquest, and one, yet again, operating along ethnic lines. Then, of course, we have the reconquest of anything still resembling, even marginally, even just stylistically, a counterculture, first by drugs that are being run in by the CIA, these supposed portals to freedom, or at least something like calm, something like ease, being as literally controlled by the most evil people in the world as you could possibly ask. And by then the process of their co-option by the police force or by the feds, whomever, living afterward, after they sign up for this program, outwardly the same lives, but just every once in a while dropping a particular line on a person of particular interest to the cops or the FBI or whoever you like. So even if, you are lucky enough to be a member of the 1970 LA counterculture who is not surrounded by secret Fed snitches, you have to act as if you are all the time. And then there is the reconquest of the entire territory of health and wellness by a clinic whose real purpose is to promote this snitch program. And the analogies there with the way the pharmaceutical industry works in the United States are perhaps too obvious to require comment. And all of this in the name, not just of, a particular vision of the way things should be, an opposing ideology, but the presumption that that ideology is the natural manifestation of American destiny, and perhaps even any presumption or ideological question, the sheer fact that Reconquest does not simply take back what it lost. Reconquest co-opts the new. Reconquest gains. Reconquest always takes back more territory than it lost the first time, because everything that appeared in the absence of the old powers, or rather the feigned absence of the old powers, in the mere impersonation of interregnum, well, Reconquest is going to take care of that too. It's going to slip inside whatever system you've devised, whether as a parallel dispensation of power or just simple physical relief. They will take it, and they'll do it in the most insidious way, not by simply tearing it away from you, but by crawling inside of it, learning how to use it better than you know, and then figuring out how to copy, mass produce, standardize, popularize it, while removing anything that ever made it, hell, not even dangerous to them, because nothing is really very dangerous to them, but just unsightly, annoying, just in contravention of what they consider good taste. And there's a particular paragraph I wanted to read from near the end of the book when Doc is stuck with a significant load of Golden Fang heroin that's been planted on him by a cop. He needs to figure out a way to give it back to the Golden Fang before they kill him over it. And he gets in contact with one of their go-betweens, which, somewhat to his surprise, is a rich suburban LA businessman named Crocker Finway. And they're talking about, well, really everything I've talked about over the last hour or so, but particularly the fact that Mickey Wolfman had a plan before he was hustled into the Criskyllidon Institute and drugged up and returned to the machinations of not just polite, but correct society. He had a plan to build a thing in the desert he was going to call arrepentimiento, which is Spanish for sorry about that. Because Mickey had apparently been doing some acid and had the sudden vision that he had been charging people for shelter his entire life when, of course, shelter should be free. So arrepentimiento was going to be this kind of semi-enclosed, not exactly an apartment complex, not exactly a city unto itself. In design terms, it sounds very much like a parody of Buckminster Fuller, geodesic domes, that kind of thing, which anyone could use for any length of time they wanted. You go out to the desert, you find this place. If there's any open space in it, it's yours as long as you want to stay there. If you just need a night on the way somewhere else, that's cool. If you need to stay there for 6 months, that's fine too. And of course, as soon as the feds and presumably some Golden Fang interlock heard about this plan, they saw to it that Mickey got his head reassembled correctly. And incidentally, the fact that arrepentimiento is it's half built, well, probably less than half built. Doc comes across the ruins of it at one point. It's in the desert somewhere between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. It sounds like it's more on the Nevada side. And I can't help, both in the location and the name, but think of nuclear bomb tests. Now, I will get into, I hope, at some point later, what I take to be the hideous but pretty much indisputable fact that the invention and explosion of the nuclear bomb is the most important event of the last century. But I think it's safe to say that the present dimensions of the American Reconquest, and particularly the technological control systems that are either its main engine or its actual substance, depending on how you want to think of it, they both flow directly from the nuclear bomb, from the politics it theoretically necessitated, and from the technology whose development it spurred. And sorry about that, in particular, arrepentimiento, and not in English, you will no doubt have noticed by now, makes me think of the hideous medical effects suffered by people who have lived near atomic testing sites, and in particular of an idea that, well, we here at Death is Just Around the Corner would never want to be unnecessarily paranoid, of course. I mean, that's the definition of paranoia, isn't it? That it's unnecessary. But we would be remiss not to mention an idea that's occurred to us more than once, namely that the atomic bombs were tested where they were, not simply because it was a large expanse of relatively unoccupied land, but because the people testing the atomic bombs also knew that they needed significant information on the radiological effects of the weapon. If it were just the explosive power, you could do that in any number of places. But half of what an atomic bomb does is, induce radiation poisoning, birth defects, various kinds of deformities, molar pregnancy, which, if you've never seen a photo of the results of a molar pregnancy, you may not have an adequate sense of anger about nuclear weapons. It has occurred to me and us as a body more than once that we didn't just test those bombs in those places because they were empty compared to other places. We tested them there precisely because the nearby populations were disproportionately Native American. And we knew from a long, long history that nobody gave a shit about Native Americans. Still to this day, nobody gives a shit about Native Americans. We've still got them on reservations. I mean, Jesus Christ. The Native American genocide started 500 years ago, and it's never stopped. The genocides of Hitler, of Stalin, of Mao, of the Turks against the Armenians, numerically pale in comparison to the indigenous genocide in the Americas. Of course, we're never going to know exactly how many people were killed by European colonization, but even on the lower end of the estimate, the figures are just vertiginously huge. If I'm not mistaken, Eduardo Galeano in the Open Veins of Latin America estimated that European colonization of the Americas probably killed somewhere between 90 and 120 million people. These are the stakes we're talking about. This is the scale of past destruction. So, with that as background, is anybody really going to care if a few hundred or even a few thousand Indians have, sudden, freakishly high incidences of cancer? If their teeth fall out, their hair falls out, skin turns gray, if, as has happened since we started using radiostrontium in certain weapons, if strontium, because it's a calcium analog, leaches into their bones, if their children are born horribly deformed or not born at all. I mean, isn't that just reservation business? Aren't we all pretty accustomed to saying, well, God, that's horrible. You only wish you could do something for these people. But it's gone on so long, and the problem is so huge, and the solutions, if they even exist, are so complicated that I don't know what I can do except feel bad about it, and my feeling bad about it doesn't do any good, so I guess I'm just not going to feel anything about it. When I hear arrepentimiento, I can't help but think of that. I can't help but think that Thomas Pynchon shares some of our suspicion that the nuclear bomb tests weren't just tests of the bombs themselves. They were radiological tests on people with no legal protection and virtually no cultural standing. So this would be yet another form of reconquest. I can't remember if it was Mike Davis who said this himself or Mike Davis quoting someone who referred to the era of large-scale nuclear testing as the second Native American genocide. But all that aside, all that fun, casual business dispensed with, Sportello needs to take this brick of heroin, or actually I think it's 20 kilos of heroin, back to the Golden Fang and finds out that his go-between is this businessman, Crocker Finway. They start talking about Mickey Wolfman and his abortive plan to start this free commune in the desert with its overtones of nuclear weapons testing. Something, incidentally, which haunts a lot of Pynchon's novels. There are very rarely explicit references to nuclear weapons, but the implicit ghost of nuclear weaponry is all over his work, and there's a lot to be said about that with respect to Gravity's Rainbow, too. So this is Crocker Finway, after hearing Doc talking about arrepentimiento and various kindred concerns. He says, "Sounds like you've been talking to His Holiness Mickey Wolfman. You've been out to have a look at Channelview Estates? Some of us moved heaven and earth, mostly earth, to keep that promise of urban blight from happening. One more episode in the struggle that's been going on for years now. Residential owners like me against developers like Brother Wolfman. People with a decent respect for preserving the environment against high-density tenement scum without the first idea of how to clean up for themselves." Sportello says, "Bullshit, Crocker. It's about your property values." And Crocker's response to this is, I think, the voice of the American Reconquest circa 1970 coming through loud and clear. He says, "It's about being in place. We," gesturing around the visitor's bar and its withdrawal into seemingly unbounded shadow, "we're in place. We've been in place forever. Look around. Real estate, water rights, oil, cheap labor, all of that's ours. It's always been ours. And you, at the end of the day, what are you? One more unit in this swarm of transients who come and go without a pause here in the sunny Southland, eager to be bought off with a car of a certain make, model, and year, a blonde in a bikini, 30 seconds on some excuse for a wave, a chili dog, for Christ's sake. We will never run out of you people. The supply is inexhaustible. Now, that's some real Reconquest, not just because, he's talking about the forces of old power and their retrenchment, not just because of his, contempt for, well, basically everything but the fetishes of his own class, but because instead of seeing, hippies, members of the counterculture, subcultures, whatever you like, as a problem, he now sees them as a resource. People who can be easily bought. People who can be turned to virtually any purpose for an incredibly low price. And this reminds me of where I want to end for the moment. A second quote. Now, I mentioned way back near the beginning of this, when I was talking about Pynchon's work at Boeing, that SAGE, the computer network, was the direct ancestor of ARPANET, which was the direct ancestor of the internet. Well, ARPANET comes up in Inherent Vice. Doc has a friend named Fritz who has access to ARPANET and sometimes looks up information on it for him. And Fritz doesn't know too much about the technology involved, so he has a kid named Sparky to help him with it. And to me, there is a fascinating contrast here, very near the end of the book, when Doc, after having looked at ARPANET a few times but not really understood it, sort of asks Sparky, what is it? How does it do what it does? And you have here in two quotes very near each other what the system of technological control can actually do, and then the lie of what it promises you. So, Sparky, talking about Fritz, says he thinks ARPANET has taken his soul. Doc thought about this. Has it? Sparky frowned off into the distance. The system has no use for souls, not how it works at all. Even this thing about going into other people's lives, it isn't like some Eastern trip of absorbing into a collective consciousness. It's only finding stuff out that somebody else didn't think you were going to. And it's moving so fast, like the more we know, the more we know. You can almost see it change one day to the next. Why I try to work late, not so much of a shock next morning. It's all pretty clunky. Down here in real life, compared to what you see in spy movies and TV, we're still nowhere near that speed or capacity. Even the infrared and night vision they're using in Vietnam is still a long way from X-ray specs. But it all moves exponentially, and someday everybody's going to wake up to find they're under surveillance they can't escape. Skips won't be able to skip no more. Maybe by then there will be no place to skip to. This is what the system can deliver. It can deliver on one level or another, in one format or another, a system of coordinates for the location of all locatable things. That is its ultimate teleology. And it, of course, gets to define what locatable means and what thing means and even what location means. And we, of course, get to have our entire realities rewired by its definition of these terms. But anything past that, anything past the provision of a grid on which there will be trillions and trillions of specific points, is bullshit. That's all it can do. Take us to a place where everything is under some kind of surveillance, and you never escape. You only move from being eavesdropped upon in one way to being eavesdropped upon in another. But then there is this exchange right afterward in which Sparky's fairly clear-eyed vision of what the system is capable of gives way to the kind of lie he's already begun believing about it. So, this is in narrative voice now. The coffee machine burst into a loud synthesized vocal of Volare. Sparky talking. Fritz programmed that in. I might have gone for Java Jive. Doc talking. Little before your time. Sparky then says, "It's all data, ones and zeros, all recoverable, eternally present." See, and that's the lie. Not that the ones and zeros are there, not that they may not be eternally recoverable on their own terms, but that the ones and zeros are equal to the thing which they claim to encode, and by encoding to remember, and by remembering to replace, to render unnecessary. Because there is, in sheerly technical terms, an enormous loss of resolution there, right? All the finesse, all the specificity, all the what people love now to call granularity is lost in that translation. And there are, of course, other levels of loss at work here, other operands in losses mathematics, not just resolution in the sense of, acoustic or visual fidelity to a source, but of the world in which that source exists, of the incomparably enormous complex of forces and things and beings between which circulate the kinds of energy that activate the original, whatever the original is. In short, the loss of the original as part of a world, any world at all, as part of a cosmology, even if it's a tiny cosmology. And one of the things I've learned in this life, I learned from, in this case, most particularly Hugh Kenner and James Joyce, is that words are never accidents. That if a word means more than one thing, it is because there is some profound connection between those two meanings, in the literal sense often of profound, that is to say, buried too deeply for us to perceive very immediately or sometimes indeed at all. And so I will end this by saying that not only do I not think it's coincidental, I goddamn know it's not coincidental that there is more than one meaning to the phrase loss of resolution. What I'm saying is, as far as I can tell, we're still here, and very excited to bring you episode number 68, part 2 of Thomas Pynchon and the American Reconquista. Well, friends, we've had some technical difficulties, some vexed questions, maritime law and specific legality in international waters, and some lapsed broadcast licenses, and the coeval and perhaps codependent lapse of the agencies which used to exist either to approve or deny the petition for the renewal of those broadcast licenses, so on and so forth. But now, here we are, you and I, and as long as we're here, as they used to say in Sigmund Freud's Vienna, let us now inverted become, ja? Und let us this inversion begin with the question of subject matter, to wit, that in the previous episode we talked about Inherent Vice, Thomas Pynchon's second most recent novel, one that concerns the end of the 1960s. And then in this episode, number 68 of Death is Just Around the Corner, we're going to talk about his second novel, period, The Crying of Lot 49, which concerns the beginning of the 1960s and which for me, despite its own author's low opinion of it, is his first really great piece of work. I think the language, the metaphorical sweep, the thematic density, the what you might call fearful rapture, all reach a level of intensity that he didn't find anywhere in his earlier work. It's a book written, as far as we can tell, from his correspondence, or at least such correspondence as has been made public, sometime between 1964 and 1965. It is fairly obviously set in 1964 once you start looking for clues. There are a number of ways to go about it. Now, the polite interpretation of the book, the one you would get in a college literary seminar, for example, is that it's a novel about what you'd call the vertigo of interpretation. The problem of recognizing what you think are patterns and codes and not having any idea if they mean anything or not. The problem, in fact, of the interplay of signs altogether without what a friend of the show, Jackie Derrida, would call a transcendental signifier, which is the sign that stands over all the rest of the signs and guarantees and certifies their meaning, that fuses them into a comprehensible and meaningful system. And thus, also a novel of that vanishingly thin line between knowledge and paranoia, because as Freud and Lacan and Pynchon and a number of other people have noted, well, knowledge is just paranoia plus social sanction, and paranoia is just knowledge, let's say, divided by social censure. That's one way to read this novel. And it's an absolutely accurate and an absolutely important one, and you could argue that it's the primary layer, but there are others. Often with Pynchon, in fact, almost universally with Pynchon, you get so caught up in the details of the diegesis, of the narrative internal to the book, that it's easy to lose sight of the larger thematic gesture. And that larger thematic gesture here on the second layer is a question basically of messaging networks, or more broadly put, the control of information. Question of who controls information and why they control it and what they do with that control, and whether or not we even know who they are, whether we would have any idea who to trust, whether we could even identify the source of any given fact on any given day, no matter how taken for consensus wisdom it may be, no matter how apparently self-evident. And on the third level, much related to the second, for reasons we'll get into, I think the entirety of The Crying of Lot 49 is haunted by the image of an event it never actually mentions, namely the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, to get at this, and we're not going to proceed in any linear way, of course, that's not what we do here. Death is just around the corner. It's not about the linear, but let's do the small service of a very basic plot summary. It's a novel about a woman named Oedipa Maas, lives somewhere unspecified in Northern California near the San Francisco, Palo Alto region. And she receives word one day that an ex-boyfriend of hers named Pierce Inverarity has died, and that he has named her co-executor of his will. And Pierce was a rich kid with all kinds of holdings, so his will is just complicated as hell. And she has to go down to Southern California to try to sort out exactly what's going on. And in the course of this sorting, she makes basically two major discoveries. The first is a kind of underground messaging system, sort of secret postal network called WASTE, or as one of its users will insist, WASTE. And the second is a comparable underground messaging system or postal service called the Tristero that appears, at least, to have been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and of which waste appears to be just the latest incarnation. Now, how do we want to start here? I think by returning briefly to a couple things that we discussed in the previous episode, namely the concept of the long 60s and the data involving Pynchon's background in the defense industry. Now, these long 60s, as I've said before, they have to do with the 60s as not a time period so much as a cultural entity, a slab of cultural stratigraphy, right? And they don't start New Year's Day 1960, they don't end New Year's Eve 1969. I, for one, would say they last from about 1964 to about 1974. And if you wanted to peg them to a couple of events, as I suggested in the earlier episode, I think you could say they started sometime around the Beatles' appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, which, if I'm not mistaken, was February 9th, 1964, and really sort of officially kicked off the British invasion in the United States. And that they ended in August 1974 with Richard Nixon's resignation over Watergate, or rather, I should say, allegedly over Watergate, outwardly over Watergate, and maybe we'll have to do an episode on that sometime too, because anyone who believes that Richard Nixon went down because Mark Felt is such a conscientious patriot that he had to tell the truth is, well, you're out of your fucking mind. And if you were of a certain turn of mind, you would say to yourself, okay, we have an era here somewhat unmoored from its own chronology, a 60s that don't start until 4 years into the 60s. We've got the event that begins them, the British invasion, the beginning of 60s pop culture as it will be memorialized and reprocessed and regurgitated and standardized and printed out 1,000,000 times over every year until we're all sick to fucking death of 60s nostalgia, and every generation will aspire to its own 60s moments. Well, what about the event that ended the era before that? What about the event that closed, the 60s that weren't the 60s? What kind of climactic impact and subsequent fissure divides the previous years from the cultural 60s? And if you were further of this turn of mind, and you had, let's say, some background in psychoanalysis, you might say to yourself, and wouldn't that event, whatever it was, the event that ended call them the parenthetical 60s and gave way to the long 60s, wouldn't that be sort of the primal scene? The event from which everything else follows, but which itself has to be censored, blacked out, silenced, buried, repressed as deeply as possible, because we can't stand to admit that all of the succeeding world emanates from it. It horrifies us. It disgusts us. It makes us feel not just awful in a general sense, but awful in the specific sense of guilt, of complicity. So we keep it as much in the dark and in the silence as we can, and we pretend not to know that everything we live in now being the long 60s, is a direct consequence of it. That's what a primal scene is. That's how it works. And you might then pursue this connection saying, okay, well, there had to be some climactic final event to the period before the long 60s. And if we continue using this psychoanalytic logic, this primal scene could never be mentioned, of course. So what event best qualifies? What happened right before 1964? The Kennedy assassination? And as long as we're talking about primal scenes and psychoanalysis and the Kennedy assassination and a woman looking into mysterious networks in control of information exchange, would it happen to be coincidence that of all the things Pynchon could have named his heroine, he named her Oedipa? Fucking Oedipa. The most Freudian, or in this case, Freudienne name possible. Uh, if you were to say all of that, I would pat you on the back and suggest that you were headed in the right direction and say, go with God. So, bearing that in mind, it's important for a number of reasons that The Crying of Lot 49 is a novel of the very beginning of the long 60s, of the cultural 60s. You know, there are no hippies here. There are arguably a couple instances or a couple personages who could qualify as sort of proto-hippies, but not really hippies. And it's clear that culturally, Oedipa, our heroine, is rooted in the mid and late 1950s. She thinks with nostalgia of Joe McCarthy and James Forrestal and Barry Goldwater and John Foster Dulles. She admits to having been a young Republican. And it's significant for a number of thematic reasons, but also because people forget about Pynchon, that though he is so identified with the 1960s and, you know, in so many ways came to embody 60s cultural themes, that his youth revolution, you know, his rebellion had nothing to do with the 1960s. In 1964, Thomas Pynchon was 27 years old. He was well out of that. You know, the music of his youth was bebop, and specifically the later, more compositionally ambitious, more improvisationally advanced forms of bebop that were happening in the mid to late 50s, which was, you know, the period during which he was, say, about 18 to 22, talking about Thelonious Monk and Ornette Coleman and the John Coltrane of Giant Steps, and later Miles's quintet, you know, the music they would come to call free bop. The character McClintock Sphere in V is obviously a kind of amalgam of Thelonious Monk and Ornette Coleman. So hippiedom, and even before hippiedom, you know, the British invasion, they were quite as strange to Pynchon as they are to Oedipa. This is not his native element, despite the comfort with which he would eventually adjust to it. Jules Siegel, his one-time Cornell roommate, said that though Pynchon eventually came to appreciate the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds quite a bit, he initially thought it was just sort of trivial teeny bopper music. And these signs of the, you know, incipience of kind of enshrined 60s culture are all over the novel, apart from Oedipa herself, her own reminiscences that, you know, there's this young band, the Paranoids, who want to look and talk and sing and sound like the Beatles, and in 1964 it's still worthy of comment because it's that rare. It still, you know, elicits a remark. A couple years later it would be so ubiquitous as to no longer be worth remarking upon. This band has a song about Lolita, and since they're all, you know, 16 or 17 years old, they're probably thinking of the movie Lolita, which came out in 1962. Given the attention span of youth, it's a safe bet that we are not too far from 1962. And there are a couple signposts provided by direct references to the Beatles, namely that Oedipa's husband, a DJ named Wendell Mucho Mas, specifically refers to the song She Loves You at one point, and that Oedipa on the highway from her home in Northern California down to San Narciso, the town where a lot of Inverarity's holdings are, she is heard listening to an obvious parody of the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand, a song called I Want to Kiss Your Feet by Sick Dick and the Volkswagens. And one of the reasons it's important that this is a book of the, you know, the very beginning of the long 60s is that for a book of that period, it is remarkably conversant with LSD, and not just with LSD itself, but with the supply chain of LSD, the way LSD got here. I'm going to get back to that in a minute because it connects us to this question of Pynchon's defense industry and military-industrial ties. As I mentioned in the previous episode, he worked for Boeing from 1960 to 1962. And the most interesting aspect of his work at Boeing had to do with a thing called SAGE, Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. Pynchon's official job there was he was basically a PR flack. He was a writer for the magazine attached to the Beaumark Project, which was an initiative to install missile bases all over the United States, allegedly in the name of intercepting Russian fighter jets, if such a thing were to happen, and then intercepting Russian ICBMs once ICBMs were invented, or rather once their invention became public, because there's a deep history there with Boeing and the Nazis, which we'll, I hope, have a chance to talk about when we get to Gravity's Rainbow. The most interesting thing about Beaumark, in turn, is that this network of missile bases, I believe 52 of them, was connected by a computer network called SAGE. This is the semi-automatic ground environment I've mentioned a couple times. Ran on dedicated cable, mainframe to mainframe, city to city, and was one of the very first modern precursors to the internet. It led directly to ARPANET, which led to DARPANET, which led right to the civilian internet, or at least, you might say, if you were in a bit of a paranoid mood, to the appearance of a civilian internet. And that's something Pynchon deals with at some length in Bleeding Edge, his most recent novel. So Pynchon knows from the very early 60s onward that this entire landmass, the continental United States, is crisscrossed by an electronic information network which could be sending virtually any kind of data. And, given the way technology develops, particularly in the military-industrial sector, will inevitably expand and be put to purposes other than its initial one. Pynchon essentially has, the rudiments of the internet in his head as early as 1962. I think, though, there's some serious evidence in The Crying of Lot 49 that he knew a couple other things, a couple other trade secrets that wouldn't come out for a while. And one of them has to do with LSD. Now, LSD was being proselytized by Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, among others, as, opening the doors of consciousness and so forth, as early as about 1963. So it's not like, no one had heard of it in 1964, but it certainly wasn't the drug du jour yet in 1964. It hadn't reached anywhere near the peak of the acid craze. And Pynchon brings it into his novel in a very, very particular way that I want to get into in some depth here. And it's very characteristic of him that he would hide something that I think is really significant in what seems like kind of an offhanded series of events. The great bulk of the novel has to do with Oedipa down in San Narciso investigating Inverarity's holdings. But before she leaves Northern California, wherever she is, to go to San Narciso, she gets a call in the middle of the night from her psychiatrist, Dr. Hilarious, who appears to be so unorthodox as to border upon being totally unqualified, and who is obsessed with the idea of getting Oedipa to join an experimental group he calls Die Brücke, the bridge, in which he'll be testing LSD on housewives. Oedipa doesn't join. Then the meat of the novel occurs, 100-odd pages, depending on your edition. And then Oedipa goes back home for a while, tries to consult with Dr. Hilarious, finds that he's barricaded himself in his office with a gun because he's convinced that the Israelis are out to get him. She talks her way into his office and bit by bit coaxes him into confessing that, yes, in fact, he was a Nazi, that yes, in fact, he did behavioral modification experiments at concentration camps. All right, so as early as 64 now, we have a direct connection between the Nazis and LSD trials, right? That's established between these two events. We also know that Pynchon would have known about Operation Paperclip. It's alluded to in enough of his other work. The U.S. military intelligence operation, which about 1,600 Nazis, mostly doctors, scientists, engineers, technologists of various kinds, were smuggled over here after World War II, usually with false identities. Most celebrated of them was Werner von Braun. The Nazis had a particular edge in rocketry, as you might know, so there's an excellent chance that Pynchon actually worked with a paperclip Nazi or two at Boeing, which he certainly would have been aware of. I wouldn't be surprised if that were the psychic genesis for Gravity's Rainbow. And he might have known, too, via the same sorts of sources of information, whether directly to him or just sort of as rumors in the trade, the kind of thing that would float around the defense contractor world, that the CIA had been testing LSD since at least 1953 in a project called MK Ultra. A lot of you have probably heard of MK Ultra, and we want to make it clear that here at Death is Just Around the Corner, we do not suggest that MK Ultra was ever successful in turning out, zombie assassins or Manchurian candidates or mind-controlled suicide bombers or whatever. MK Ultra was mostly a massive, stupid failure in which assholes who didn't know what they were doing tested drugs they didn't understand on subjects who had no idea what was happening to them. But though that is true, MK Ultra also did happen. MK Ultra engaged in hundreds and hundreds of different projects over its 20-odd years of existence, and the testing of LSD was prominent among them. Most famous incidents of which was the 1960 trial at Harvard, one of whose test subjects was, of course, Timothy Leary, which set him off on the trail of being the proselyte of acid, and perhaps also a CIA asset, something we need to look into further here. And if we ever do an episode on Ted Kaczynski, we're going to have a lot to say about that particular Harvard acid trial and the man who administered it, Dr. Henry Murray, because boy, is there some interesting stuff in his background. Suffice it to say that even a cursory scanning of Henry Murray's career makes it pretty clear that Harvard trial was indeed a CIA MK Ultra trial. All right, so now we've got linkages between the Nazis, Operation Paperclip, the CIA, the testing of acid, and we're up to 1964, in which Oedipa's ex-Nazi psychiatrist is trying to get her to take acid. She never does it, but he does eventually persuade her husband, Wendell Mucho Mas. And though he is a very minor character in The Crying of Lot 49, I think the way acid changes him is another of Pynchon's little hints, little oblique sort of narrative shards that loom much larger in retrospect than they do in the novel itself. Mucho, you see, is a radio DJ, plays top 40 music, doesn't particularly believe in it or like it, and knows that his on-air persona is a complete put-on, tries desperately hard to believe that the music he's playing, and here we should be inferring, very early British invasion pop, tries desperately hard to believe that it means anything, but just can't believe it means anything. Still, that job is better for him and his hypersensitivity than his previous job selling used cars, because he could not get over the sheer density of material history embodied in each of those used cars. And I want to read you a passage here at length because, well, you'll see why. Yet at least he had believed in the cars, maybe to excess. How could he not, seeing people poorer than him come in, Negro, Mexican, cracker, a parade 7 days a week bringing the most god-awful of trade ends, motorized metal extensions of themselves, of their families, and what their whole lives must be like, out there so naked for anybody, a stranger like himself, to look at, frame cockeyed, rusty underneath, fender repainted in a shade just off enough to depress the value, if not mucho himself, inside smelling hopelessly of children, supermarket booze, two, sometimes three generations of cigarette smokers, or only of dust. And when the cars were swept out, you had to look at the actual residue of these lives. And there was no way of telling what things had been truly refused, when so little, he supposed, came by that out of fear most of it had to be taken and kept, and what had simply, perhaps tragically, been lost. Clipped coupons promising savings of 5 or 10 cents, trading stamps, pink flyers advertising specials at the markets, butts, tooth-shy combs, help-wanted ads, yellow pages torn from the phone book, rags of old underwear or dresses that already were period costumes for wiping your own breath off the inside of a windshield with so you could see whatever it was, a movie, a woman or car you coveted, a cop who might pull you over just for drill, all the bits and pieces coated uniformly like a salad of despair in a gray dressing of ash, condensed exhaust, dust, body wastes. It made him sick to look, but he had to look. If it had been an outright junkyard, probably he could have stuck things out, made a career. The violence that had caused each wreck being infrequent enough, far enough away from him to be miraculous, as each death, up till the moment of our own, is miraculous. But the endless rituals of trade-in, week after week, never got as far as violence or blood, and so were too plausible for the impressionable Mucho to take for long. Mucho, clearly, incredibly sensitive and just overloaded by the amount of history, objective history, material history, present, latent, drifting from each of these objects. And doesn't that sound, in its way, like one sort of description of Pynchon's prose? You know, digging through the junk and dirt and garbage and wreckage of history and trying to alchemize it into something else, trying to find, the harmonic of grace running through it, to see it in a light, as he would say, that strikes against the day. This is Mucho before LSD. By the end of the book, in Oedipus' absence, Dr. Hilarious has convinced Mucho to try acid. And listen to him now, talking about his job as a radio DJ. Whenever I put the headset on now, I really do understand what I find there. When those kids sing about she loves you, yeah, well, she does. She's any number of people, all over the world, back through time, different colors, sizes, ages, shapes, distances from death, but she loves, and the you is everybody, and herself, Oedipa, the human voice, it's a flipping miracle. And cutting ahead a little bit, Oedipa asks him, "That's LSD?" Mucho smiled back. "Where'd you get it?" Knowing. Hilarious. He broadened his program to include husbands. "Look then," Oedipa said, trying to be businesslike, "how long has it been that you've been on this?" He honestly couldn't remember. "But there may be a chance you're not addicted yet." Ed, looking at her puzzled, "You don't get addicted. It's not like you're some hophead. You take it because it's good, because you hear and see things, even smell them, taste like you never could, because the world is so abundant. No end to it, baby. You're an antenna sending your pattern out across 1,000,000 lives a night, and they're your lives too. The songs, it's not just that they say something, they are something, in the pure sound, something new, and my dreams have changed." So, after Hilarious's treatment, quote unquote, via LSD, which is, I think he calls it an experiment, and in terms of supply chains, I think it's clearly inferred that it's a CIA experiment, or at least CIA related. This man who was obsessed with the material marginalia of history and the possible light left in them, their possible alchemical redemption, he has now become an apostle of the permanent groovy vibration, of the universal oneness of the Om, of the all, of the total, of the everyone. All historical anxiety has completely deserted him. He's not interested in history anymore. He's interested in she loves you, she being every she, and loves being all love, and you being all the you anywhere, ever, at all times. That to me suggests that Pynchon had some pretty clear opinions about the introduction of LSD into the early counterculture. That A, it wasn't really accidental, and that B, at least circa the writing of Crying of Lot 49, it wasn't fucking beneficial. Now, as to the not being accidental, you can take that to, any length of conspiracy you like, from the simply haphazard that, let's say, the CIA decided to circulate acid among a bunch of hipsters and proto-hippies in the hope that it would pacify them or render them docile or make them more suggestible to various forms of social control, and accidentally ended up, sparking some sort of, if not revolution, then at least temporary reorientation in Western consciousness. That would be the mild version. The harsher version would be that the CIA, after at least 10 and maybe more years experimentation with LSD by this point, realized quite well that its initial hopes for the drug, i.e. that it would serve as an interrogation aid or a behavioral modification agent or a, quote unquote, brainwashing substance, the magical elixir of the intelligence community, since we made it up to explain why some of our soldiers defected in South Korea. The CIA knew quite well by the mid-60s that LSD was no fucking good for any of that. You bring a witness in and give him acid, what you're not going to get is a lot of useful information. But after so much research, they would also have known that LSD in any great quantity will tend to do two things. It will either lead the user toward a state of compulsively introspective self-obsession, or, well, I should say, and or, if the user has any particular prior disposition toward mental illness, it will leave the habitue in basically a state of vegetative psychosis that sometimes persists for as long as one's entire life. So the harsher reading here would be to say that the CIA introduced acid to the American counterculture because it knew perfectly well that after enough time and enough hits, all these kids who were concerned with politics, with social change, with cultural rebirth, would become self-obsessed, self-indulgent decadents, would become just another sort of, 1890 yellow book generation, completely fixated on themselves and their pleasure, and not just fixated on their pleasure, but convinced that the pursuit of pleasure was somehow a form of righteousness in and of itself, that there was in fact a holiness, a sacredness, a religious import to seeking what one wanted, because of course what one wanted only because of the, harmonic interactions of the cosmos, or whatever other bullshit, Stevie Nicks liked to talk about in 1974. And if that was the CIA's basic idea, introducing acid into the subculture, well, it fucking worked, didn't it? There wasn't there, an enormous and observable shift in priorities in the counterculture such as it existed between, say, 1964 and 1970. And of course, a great amount of that, too, had to do with government violence against the few counterculture organizations that remained any more committed to serious politics. And here I'd be thinking of the assassination of Fred Hampton, perhaps foremost, Although the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, though they weren't exactly what you'd call counterculture figures, they rank pretty high on that goddamn list, too. And by the war on drugs, which you'll notice was not terribly targeted at acid in its early years. Its two major points of emphasis were marijuana and heroin. And Ehrlichman, you remember that name? John Ehrlichman? Nixon's, well, one of his two closest little fucking weasel adjutants. I believe his official position was assistant for domestic affairs, something along those lines. Ehrlichman has, as I may have mentioned before, confessed on not one but two occasions that the explicit purpose of the war on drugs was to target, in his words, hippies and Negroes, and that they realized that if they could associate the hippie with marijuana and the Negro with heroin, and then use drugs as the pretext to destroy their lives, that would serve as an enormous initiative for police departments all around the country to go out shutting down the counterculture, essentially, kicking the shit out of its members, getting them evicted, destroying their possessions, destroying their bank accounts, their lives, and a massive stimulus to federal spending on police militarization as well. So, acid, of course, had its day of demonization too, but it's interesting to note that Ehrlichman, one of the central engines of the war on drugs, at least in its first incarnation, did not mention LSD as one of the drugs that the Nixon administration was determined to go after to associate with any group of undesirables. He may be telling us something by omission there. I suppose you can decide what you like. And if you think that's a reach when it comes to the crying of Lot 49, well, let me reach a little bit further. Let me tell you about something else that Pynchon, through the grapevine of defense contractors, military industrial employees, might have known something else about. And let me preface it with a theme that keeps popping up with odd persistence in the novel. That theme is the mistreatment of soldiers' bodies, and particularly their corpses. And this comes up 3 different times. The first two both have to do with holdings of the late Pierce Inverarity. One is a cigarette company, and this cigarette company advertises itself by pointing out that its filters are made with real bone charcoal. Oedipa asks what, as in whose bones? Metzger, the co-executor of Pierce's will, doesn't know until the next day when they go out and encounter case number 2. Inverarity also owned a luxury real estate development called Fangoso Lagoons, all faux Italian, including canals and a central building that's meant to look like something you might find along the Riviera. And one of the attractions boasted at Fangoso Lagoons is scuba diving. And in the bottom of these canals set up for scuba diving, there are real human bones. And again, Oedipus says, what? And the story, as it transpires, is that both the bones in the cigarettes and the bones at the bottom of the canals come from a squadron of American soldiers who were decimated and mostly left dead at the bottom of the lake in Italy in 1944, which were then harvested from the bottom of the lake and fenced to the United States by the mafia. All right? So there are 2 cases. Third case, Oedipa and Metzger go to a play at one point, a fictional Jacobean revenge play called The Courier's Tragedy by the imaginary Richard Warfinger. And one of the minor plot lines in the play concerns a squadron of soldiers who mysteriously disappeared, possibly into a lake, and it is later disclosed that their bones are being ground up into a special kind of ink by the play's antagonist, the evil Duke Angelo. So, three instances of soldiers' bodies being misused, strikes me as far too many, especially in Pynchon, for this to be merely an idle fixation. And inferring from the way he treats LSD in this novel, the kind of thing he might have known before the rest of the public knew it, he might well have known that though the Harvard acid trial in 1960 was the most famous, LSD, as I mentioned before, had been tried a number of times before in a number of different experiments. And one reminds me in particular of the theme of mistreatment of soldiers' bodies. About 35 miles northeast of Baltimore, there is a town called Aberdeen, Maryland, and the center of that town is an enormous military installation called the Aberdeen Proving Ground. And one of the facilities at the Aberdeen Proving Ground is a huge arms depot called the Edgewood Arsenal. From 1948 to 1975, the American military tested various chemical weapons on its own soldiers at the Edgewood Arsenal, sometimes with their knowledge and consent, sometimes without it, sometimes for pay, sometimes not. They tested LSD there, as well as PCP, cannabinoids, and BZ, a proprietary psychedelic about which there may or may not be more to say later. But it got a good deal more serious than LSD and PCP. They also tested irritants, riot control agents, anticholinesterase nerve agents, including VX, sarin, organophosphorus, and carbamate pesticides, mustard gas, nerve agent antidotes, including atropine and scopolamine, and nerve agent reactivators, including 2-PAM chloride. Over and over, for years and years, our own soldiers becoming the subjects of chemical weapons tests. And if you happen to have read Frank Zappa's autobiography, you will remember that he grew up partly near Baltimore and that his dad, Sicilian immigrant Francesco Zappa, was one of the victims, or let's say test subjects, of the Edgewood Arsenal chemical warfare tests. That for a few extra dollars a week, Papa Francesco would come home covered in strange patches, and when his kids asked about them, he would say, "No, it's nothing. It's medicine, or it's something the government wants me to wear, and they're giving me some extra money. Don't worry about it." So, apart from the test subjects themselves, if this is how the tests were being done, who knows how many thousands more people the military may have exposed to chemical weaponry in that period. The preternaturally historicized and preternaturally cynical view of LSD that Pynchon has in The Crying of Lot 49 suggests to me that this, repetitious theme of the maltreatment of soldiers indicates some knowledge that, LSD was tested in a whole lot of places, and in some of those places, other things were tested too. All of which has been so far in the way of a kind of hypertrophied prologue, and to get at least to some extent to the plot of the book itself, although that's really not what we do here at Death is Around the Corner. Well, we've already talked about Oedipa the name. Oedipa is the one who goes looking for the primal scene, the unmentionable thing that presides over all the following culture. Maas, as Charles Hollander has helpfully noted, Maaswerk is Dutch for the underside of a tapestry, and Maas itself means tracery in the sense of stone carving or architecture. So, the hunt after the source and the secret underside of all the tracings. And no accident either that the town that Oedipa goes to investigate Inverarity's holdings is called San Narciso, or San Narciso, if we're being proper about it. Obviously, Narciso, the Spanish version of Narcissus. Now, people remember what Narcissus means because they know the term narcissism, but they always forget the other half of that story. as it's told by Ovid in the Metamorphoses. That Narcissus falls in love with his own image staring in a lake. Yeah, sure. But the reason he falls in love with his own image is that nearby there is a nymph named Echo who is in love with him. And Echo is trying to tell him that she's in love with him, but she's so shy that she won't emerge from the foliage. So Narcissus looks at his own image, hears Echo's voice, thinks it's the voice of his reflection, and thus falls in love with that reflection, and in some versions of the story, drowns in the lake. So San Narciso is not just, an idle reference to narcissism. It's a very compact two-word description of a society so transfixed by its own image that it can't attribute any voice to anything but itself. Everything it hears, it psychically converts into its own internal monologue, as it were. All possible broadcast is broadcast coming from it to it. There can be no other voices. So naturally, Pynchon has Oedipus stay at a hotel called Echo Courts. Echo being, of course, not just the nymph, but the thing the society is hearing and mistaking for something else. And just for historical value, because I'm sure Tom would have appreciated this too, there was a Saint Narcissus, an actual Saint Narcissus. His birth and death dates are very much in question. The last listing I saw said born sometime around 90 A.D., died sometime around 212 A.D., which is a hell of a lifespan. He is most notable in church history for having presided over the council that decreed Easter's celebration should always fall on a Sunday, regardless of what day Passover was, which is interesting. I actually didn't know until researching this episode that in the early Christian church, Easter and Passover were the same holiday, that the resurrection of Christ was held to be thematically and spiritually contiguous with and continuous from the Passover. It was only St. Narcissus, with a little bit of help from some other counselors, who turned Easter into an exclusively Christian holiday with no roots in Judaism. So we have something here like Mucho's LSD-induced loss of concern with, of care for, the texture and contents of history. And then the most famous moment literarily in The Crying of Lot 49 is probably the first one in which Oedipa begins the drive down to San Narciso from Northern California, very beginning of chapter 2. And I want to read that at its full length because there's a lot going on here. San Narciso lay further south, near L.A. Like many named places in California, it was less an identifiable city than a grouping of concepts, census tracts, special purpose bond issue districts, shopping nuclei, all overlaid with access roads to its own freeway. But it had been Pierce's domicile and headquarters, the place he'd begun his land speculating in 10 years ago, and so put down the plinth course of capital on which everything afterward had been built, however rickety or grotesque, toward the sky. And that, she supposed, would set the spot apart, give it an aura. But if there was any vital difference between it and the rest of Southern California, it was invisible at first glance. She drove into San Narciso on a Sunday in a rented Impala. Nothing was happening. She looked down a slope, needing to squint for the sunlight, onto a vast sprawl of houses which had grown up all together, like a well-tended crop, from the dull brown earth, and she thought of the first time she'd opened a transistor radio to replace a battery and seen her first printed circuit. The ordered swirl of houses and streets from this high angle sprang at her now with the same unexpected, astonishing clarity as the circuit card had. Though she knew even less about radios than about Southern Californians, there were, to both outward patterns, a hieroglyphic sense of concealed meaning, of an intent to communicate. There seemed no limit to what the printed circuit could have told her if she'd tried to find out. So in her first minute of San Narciso, a revelation also trembled just past the threshold of her understanding. Smog hung all around the horizon. The sun on the bright beige countryside was painful. She and the Chevy seemed parked at the center of an odd religious instant, as if on some other frequency, or out of the eye of some whirlwind rotating too slow for her heated skin even to feel the centrifugal coolness of, words were being spoken. She suspected that much. She thought of Mucho, her husband, trying to believe in his job. Was it something like this he felt, looking through the soundproof glass at one of his colleagues with a headset clamped on, and cueing the next record with movements stylized as the handling of chrism, censer, chalice might be for a holy man, yet really tuned into the voices, the music, its message, surrounded by it, digging it, as were all the faithful it went out to? Did Mucho stand outside Studio A looking in, knowing that even if he could hear it, he couldn't believe in it? As I say, lot, lot going on there. And we have the explicit allusion to the myth of Echo, that thing about the voice she can't quite hear, the whirlwind she can't quite feel, the centrifugal coolness of. There are a couple places to focus on this. One of them being glyphs, his specific mention of hieroglyphs. And Pynchon, I'm guessing, would know enough about etymology, orthography, the evolution of writing systems to know more or less how glyphs work, which is that, you begin with pictographs, a written sign that is supposed to resemble the thing it names. But you pretty soon get into the difficulty of trying to come up with signs for processes or for concepts or for relations of things. And so you come up with the logograph or hieroglyph, which literally means sacred writing. It was the sort of 19th century British term for the Egyptian writing system. And what the logograph or hieroglyph does is put together a series of pictographs, associate them in such a way that they compose a kind of, say, electromagnetic field, that a current circulates between them. And this current becomes the meaning that they emit. Their relations define a process or concept or abstraction. In exactly the same way, all of these plots of land she's seeing in San Narciso, whether or not she knows what they're for, whether or not Pierce even knew what they were for, define a certain abstraction, define a process, an energy flow, an electromagnetic field. And on one level, that's the pure flow of money. On another, it is the particular vision of land reclaimed by developers who are inevitably going to overcharge for whatever's built on it, and the builders who are then going to, overcharge in turn, and the eventual owners or landlords who are then going to overcharge their tenant, this massive downward cascade of exponential extortion. There is also the specific vision of the land itself retaken for any purpose that is not allowed just to be land, not simply there, not a geographical fact, not part of the earth, not even harnessed to a kind of purpose naturally emanating from it, whatever that might be in the Southern California desert, but used as if it were pure blank canvas, just stamped on, entire cities tacked to it, cloth backdrops and fucking furniture staples. It's very much the feeling I get when I go to Los Angeles. It's part of my fascination with Los Angeles, or with Arizona, or with certain parts of New Mexico. The feeling that the entire human landscape is very lightly bolted down, and everything at just a moment, at the wrong screw going rusty, at the wrong second, it could all be torn completely away and right back to desert. There is that in the hieroglyph. There is also the specific mention of printed circuitry. And this activates on, God, any number of levels. Because, number one, Southern California is a huge home of the defense industry. An enormous component of whose machinery is, of course, printed circuitry. So in an absolutely literal sense, The printed circuit, its supply chains, its technological requirements, its mechanical abilities, its necessary material constituents, they literally are defining the patterning of real estate in Southern California. It is because of the printed circuit that X lot is being given over to Y purpose. This is literally true. And we learn later in the book that one of Inverarity's main holdings is a big chunk of a defense firm called Yo-Yo-Dyne, which the keen-eyed Pynchon reader will recognize from both V and Gravity's Rainbow as being owned by Clayton Chicklets, alias Bloody Chicklets, a horrible bigot and war profiteer. Printed circuitry also, in this specific instance, makes us, or should make us, think of the way these technologies were changing in the early 1960s after the introduction of the transistor, which made possible the integrated circuit. And I could get into the technicalities of this, but they're confusing and kind of complicated. And friends, I'm not posing as an expert here. What you need to know about them, essentially, is that from the circuit to the transistor to the integrated printed circuit evolves a pathway of miniaturization and enormous amplification of power and bandwidth, which makes possible computing in its modern sense. You know, the transistor and the integrated circuit are how we go from room-sized mainframes at UCLA to the laptop or, you know, phone or whatever on which you're probably listening to this right now. And that is yet another tie-in to this, you know, this religious instant, this glyphic vision, that technology in general after World War II in the United States is almost entirely a byproduct of the military-industrial complex. You know, we talk about the technological revolution, the electrical age, the information age, as if it just came from nowhere, as if it fell out of the fucking sky, emerged from a crack in the ground and declared, "Behold, you shall now be informed." No, what happened was that the Cold War provided a permanent, ongoing, alleged justification for enormous expenditure on weapons research, which required all kinds of further research into electronic equipment of a million different kinds. And that's where almost all of your personal scale, you know, handheld or lap held or desk held electronic devices come from. That's why we have the world we have. All this shit was built as a side effect, essentially, of the nuclear bomb and of the stalemate that would provoke for the better part of the next 50 years. And there is an explicit joke about this when Oedipa and Metzger go into a club called The Scope, where they're playing electronic music, and not electronic music in, you know, the modern sense, not dance music, but elektronische music, you know, avant-garde electro shit. As the bartender there mentions, primarily that Darmstadt sound, referring presumably to Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and his work in early computer music at Darmstadt. The computers used to make that early computer music utterly outgrowths of military-industrial spending. It was essentially an accident, the discovery that they could synthesize musical tones and frequencies, that they could perform what's called FM synthesis, adding separate frequencies together to simulate, you know, the harmonic series of a given actual instrument, you know, guitars or pianos or whatever. So every piece of electronic music you've ever heard, including pieces of music that just make electronic use of, say, a reproduced string section, directly from the nuclear bomb, the Cold War, the defense contractors. And here's the thing. In this present context, electronic music doesn't just mean music made electronically. It also means music reproduced electronically. So pretty much every piece of music you haven't heard live, every piece of music you've heard in a recorded format other than, you know, a wax cylinder or shellac disc, everything essentially on tape, CD, Laserdisc, or any digital format directly from the military industrial complex, directly from the nuclear bomb and World War II money. And as long as we're talking World War II, we ought to mention as well the specific history of the transistor that leads to the integrated circuit that leads to all this modern electronic equipment. And got to give credit to the excellent journalist Corey Pine here for unearthing all this. The fellow who invented the modern transistor is named William Shockley, and he was essentially an American Nazi. He was a great devotee of the idea that race and intelligence were related, obsessed with eugenics, wanted to sterilize everyone who had an IQ under 100, and he was going on TV as late as the 1970s saying these things, that, much to his regret, non-white races simply had the wrong skull shape and thus a lacking intellectual capacity. It was nothing he was proud of, but we had to be realistic and do with these people what was necessary. Thus, if not inaugurating, certainly helping to speed along the great history of post-World War II fascism in American technology, and particularly Silicon Valley, which we see blooming now with such comic book villain scale assholes as Peter Thiel, who literally wants to buy your blood. A whole lot of Nazis concealing themselves as libertarians in the 80s and 90s. Whole lot of talk about freedom, about moving around, untracked in an open landscape that was essentially code for corporate state fascism, Hans Hermann Hoppe fascism, in which literally the only law would be the law of property. This kind of thought, it's not just not uncommon in Silicon Valley, it may in fact be the rule among the most important and wealthiest people in Silicon Valley. And Corey's got a book coming out about that called Live, Work, 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 Die. I haven't read it yet. We at Death is Just Around the Corner, we're not the kind of people who get review copies, but when it does come out, I'm sure I will read it. Since we're talking about military technology, time to talk about Tristero and waste, the two central thematic devices of the book. Now, as I have alluded to earlier, I think it's pretty obvious that waste is a direct parody of Sage. That it's a secret messaging network that is, though many of its users might not know so, at least in the case of waste, operated primarily by very right-wing defense industry types, including Mike Fallopian, who, as Metzger says of him, is so far right that he's almost an anarchist. And Oedipa finds people using waste all over the place, particularly all over San Francisco. There's a long and excellent sequence, one of Pynchon's best, I think, in which she runs into people from, hobos under bridges to little kids playing hopscotch to, Mexican anarchists in exile, all of whom are using waste. And I think this is a prevision, really, a prediction of the internet that he extrapolated from Sage. Oh, one day this kind of electronic information exchange is going to be generally available. It'll be out there for everyone, and everyone will think that he or she is anonymous and safe and using it of his or her own volition, and none of them will know that it's ultimately run by the military-industrial complex and that they can see every goddamn thing you're doing. If you've paid attention to the news in, I don't know, the last 10 years or so, you might happen to know that Pynchon was exactly right about all of that. And as I mentioned before, the military origins of the internet are also a topic of discussion in Bleeding Edge, in which it's pointed out that, We talk about military origins as if there were then a linear progression in time away from the origins. That's not what happens. There is instead a stratified accretion, a building up, which means that the origins, though they may be concealed from view, are always, always, always there at the bottom. Pull them out and the entire thing collapses. The internet is, was, always has been based on the military-industrial complex and on the prerogatives of the intelligence agencies, and it wouldn't fucking exist without them. And that, in turn, brings us to Tristero, the apparent, hundreds of years old illicit mail service of which waste would seem to be the latest incarnation. Now, Oedipa discovers Tristero at this play I mentioned earlier, The Courier's Tragedy. And the play, it's a very, very accurate recreation of a Jacobean revenge drama in that it has a million plot points, many of which are totally unnecessary, and scenes go on way too long. But the heart of it is this, that there is a good duke, a guy named Duke Niccolo, who, when he was very young, had his dukedom stolen from him by an evil duke named Duke Angelo. Angelo told one of his assistants to have Niccolo killed, but the assistant didn't do it. Niccolo, now grown up and unrecognizable, is hanging around Angelo's court looking for a chance to strike at him. This is all framed in terms of not just the conflict between these two dukes, but the conflict between two letter-carrying services. One of them, Taunus, and one of them, the almost unmentionable Tristero. Taunus, completely real organization. It was a real thing. Its origins are a little bit chronologically shadowy, but basically from some point in the 16th century to about the 1860s, it was the official mail carrier for a number of different European states and empires, most notably the Holy Roman Empire early in its career. And though we in the United States, we're uncomfortable with the idea of anything having a history, because that would mean we would have to learn it and think about it, we're especially uncomfortable with the idea of something like a postal service having a history, much less an ideological bent. It's the postal service. It picks up your letters, it takes them where they're supposed to go. Well, in the era before state-run postal services, no, you had to hire a particular company to do this. And that particular company had to be, invested with your trust that the right messages were going to the right people for the right reasons, which effectively makes a postal service what? An intelligence agency. What do intelligence agencies do? They gather and they transmit messages. Exactly what a non-state monopolized, a free-floating and independent postal service would do. And this was the service that Taunus provided for various clients over about 300 years. Niccolo is hanging around the court of Angelo, pretending to be an agent of Taunus. I hope it's become clear by now that I think this is the closest Pynchon, and for that matter, Oedipa, ever get in The Crying of Lot 49 to talking directly about JFK. Niccolo, at the court of the evil duke, pretending to be Taunus. Okay, so let's transpose this. JFK, the President of the United States, pretending to be more or less in consonance with the same forces that have been running the country since the end of World War II, and particularly since the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, when Allen J. Dulles began to turn the CIA into what it is now, the American SS. But though he is posing as a Taunus representative, he's actually waiting for his chance to strike show people what's been going on the entire time, show them the birthright of which he, and by extension they, have been deprived. And there is an extremely bitter irony in the naming here. You get into etymologies. Nicolo, from the Latin Nicolaus, from the Greek Nikolaos, which means literally victory people and implicitly victory to the people. Presumably, if JFK had lived, victory to the people. And there was also, of course, as Pynchon would have known by that point, a surface-to-air missile called the Nike. That's the Nike in Nikolaos. Angelo, from Latin angelus, from the Greek agalos, messenger. So even though at no point in this play does Angelo involve himself in the explicit politics of Turnus Taxis versus this other thing, the Tristero, he is the messenger because he has on his side, at least for a while, the agents of the secret messaging service, the people who, as it were, actually deliver the mail. And Niccolò, after a lot of plot convolution, ends up riding out to what he hopes will be his glory and, reinstatement as the head of his rightful dukedom, to be killed in the forest by 3 agents of the Tristero. It's the only time anyone says Tristero in the entire play. And the 3 agents, though they are visible, their faces are, as Pynchon describes them, somehow distorted behind gauze masks. Anyone who's spent any time thinking about or reading about Kennedy will hear Niccolo being killed by 3 assassins and immediately think of the 3 tramps. Those 3 men who mysteriously appeared on a boxcar right behind the grassy knoll with guns, were taken in for police questioning, and then were released, never named, never interrogated, and suspiciously well-dressed and well-kempt for alleged hobos. I think that Pynchon is more or less directly saying here, as directly as he can, given that, this is the primal scene, this is the Oedipal covering / uncovering what both gives and withholds, that he suspects that the intelligence services, and I would say particularly the CIA in the case of, message carrying, were directly implicated in Kennedy's death. And given the fact that in this book he has, via waste, alluded to sage, via LSD, alluded to, at the very least, Operation Paperclip and the Harvard trial, if not indeed the Edgewood Arsenal trial, through the theme of the bones, alluded to American chemical weapons testing on our own soldiers, and then through, Niccolo as false representative of Turnus Taxis, coming eventually to give the people the word, and then killed by 3 mysterious tramps all alone. It starts to make sense that, as Jules Siegel, his former roommate, records it, he was scared all the time. As I may have mentioned before, Siegel said to him something to the effect of, why would you be scared all the time? The things you've written could get you out of any amount of trouble. And then Tom made it clear to him that it was the things he'd written that he expected to get him in trouble. I have wondered even if Pynchon's professedly low opinion of The Crying of Lot 49, and he really drubs it in the introduction to Slow Learner, his reissued book of short stories, if that is not perhaps a way to distract the audience, both general and specifically critical, from looking directly at its implications, because God knows if I were Pynchon and were 2 years out of working at fucking Boeing with all the things I would have learned there, particularly in the climate of the Cold War, particularly remembering, God, the Rosenbergs, for Christ's sake, I would be pretty goddamn scared to have written this book, even in terms as oblique and narratively couched as the terms given here. And I can't help but think of the eeriness of the title, The Crying of Lot 49. If you've read the book that what it refers to is a set of stamps that used to belong to Inverarity going up for auction, stamps that have implications to do with the existence of the Tristero and so forth, and that they are the 49th lot in an auction, and that the crying of a lot means simply, its announcement and auctioning by the crier. But it's always struck me, and must have struck Pynchon, as an incredibly weird and mournful phrase. And between, the Tristero, which I take to represent intelligence services, for a long time past, but specifically American intelligence services now, tied in with the waste network of, right-wing defense contractors, and with the hieroglyphic vision of, California real estate and the way technology and money are printing out literally a hieroglyph of secret purpose on the land. I can't help hearing that phrase, the crying of Lot 49, and thinking of an empty lot somewhere numbered 49, and the sound of the wind blowing through it, like that unheard echo, like the voice Narcissus mistakes for the voice of his own reflection, trying to tell us something that we are either unequipped or utterly unwilling to hear.